Japanese forest. Welcome to the channel Close Eyes. Today's I tell you story, Japanese forest. A group of students explores Japan's Aokigahara forest, known as the Forest of Suicides, to document paranormal activity. As night falls, they encounter eerie screams and ghostly figures among the trees. Join us as we delve into the dark secrets of this haunted forest. Part 1. Aokigahara Forest, Japan, the Forest of Suicides, has always fascinated me with its dark reputation. The stories of despair and hauntings surrounding it were both chilling and intriguing. When my friends and I, a group of university students with a passion for the paranormal, decided to spend a night there documenting any phenomena, we knew we were stepping into the heart of darkness. Our group consisted of 5 of us: me, Ken, Aiko, Haru, and Yumi. Each of us had our reasons for being drawn to this place, though none were as personal as Haru's. He had lost a relative under mysterious circumstances, and the Aokigahara forest had become a symbol of his unresolved grief. As we approached the forest's entrance, the sky darkened, and the oppressive weight of the trees seemed to close in on us. The forest was eerily silent, except for the crunch of leaves beneath our feet. The air was damp and heavy, carrying a chill that cut through our jackets. It was a feeling of foreboding that none of us could shake. "I've read that the forest's energy can be overwhelming," Aiko said, adjusting her camera. "We should be prepared for anything." Ken, always the skeptic, rolled his eyes. "It's just a forest. If we don't find any ghosts, at least we'll have some interesting footage." Haru, however, was uncharacteristically quiet. His face was pale, and he seemed lost in thought. I could tell that the forest held more significance for him than the rest of us understood. We set up our base camp near a clearing, away from the main trails to avoid disturbing any potential visitors. Abandoned tents were scattered around the area, left behind by those who had come before us, and presumably never returned. Each tent was a stark reminder of the forest's grim reputation. Haru stumbled upon a weathered notebook partially buried under the leaves. It was filled with handwritten notes, their words tinged with despair and sorrow. "I can't take it anymore," one note read. "The forest calls to me. I'm beyond saving." The notes were unsettling but fascinating. They provided a glimpse into the minds of those who had come here seeking an end to their pain. As the sun began to set, the forest took on an even more ominous air. Shadows lengthened and twisted in the fading light, and the once familiar sounds of the forest now seemed foreign and foreboding. We decided to split up for a while to cover more ground. Ken and Yumi ventured to the east, while Aiko, Haru, and I headed north. Our plan was to document any strange occurrences and reconvene before dark. Haru, clutching a handheld EVP recorder, walked a few paces ahead of us, his eyes scanning the forest with an intensity that was almost palpable. As night fell, the forest transformed. The once vibrant green foliage was now a black sea of silhouettes, the trees looming like silent sentinels. The air grew colder, and the silence was punctuated only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of an owl. We set up our equipment in a small clearing. The forest seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something. Aiko was adjusting her camera when a low, guttural moan echoed through the trees. It was so unnatural that it sent a shiver down my spine. "Did anyone else hear that?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Aiko nodded, her face pale. "It sounded like it came from over there." We followed the sound, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The moaning grew louder and more anguished, but there was no sign of any source. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees pressing in on all sides. Suddenly, we came across an old, abandoned tent, its fabric torn and faded. It was eerily out of place among the dense forest. Haru approached it cautiously, peering inside. "It's empty," he said, his voice trembling. "But look at these." He pointed to several items scattered around the tent: a tattered blanket, a few personal belongings, and a torn photograph of a family. The photograph was old and stained, the faces barely visible. It was a stark reminder of the people who had come here with hope, only to find despair. As we examined the tent, the forest around us seemed to grow even darker. The air was filled with an oppressive silence, and the sense of being watched was overwhelming. The moaning had stopped, but an unsettling feeling lingered. "Let's head back to camp," Aiko suggested, her voice barely masking her fear. "We need to regroup before it gets any darker." We retraced our steps, the forest now an almost alien landscape of shadows and strange noises. Every sound seemed amplified, and the darkness felt almost tangible. Our flashlights flickered as if struggling against the encroaching gloom. When we finally reached our base camp, Ken and Yumi were already there, their faces ashen. "You won't believe what we saw," Ken said, his voice trembling. "We saw figures. Ghostly shapes wandering among the trees. They didn't look like people. It was like they were made of shadows." Yumi nodded in agreement, her eyes wide with fear. They were moving, but not like people. It was unsettling. The feeling of dread was palpable as we gathered around the campfire. The night seemed to stretch endlessly, filled with the eerie sounds of the forest. The forest, once a curious and mysterious place, had become a nightmarish labyrinth of despair and fear. As we huddled together, trying to stay warm and calm, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. The forest seemed alive with a malevolent presence, and the whispers of the lost souls were all around us. In the cold, dark night, we had only scratched the surface of the horrors that Aokigahara Forest held. The spirits of those who had come seeking peace, but found only torment, were now a part of our reality. What lay ahead was unknown, but we were about to delve deeper into the heart of this dark and haunted forest. Part 2. The oppressive atmosphere of Aokigahara Forest weighed heavily on us as we huddled around the campfire. The night seemed to stretch on endlessly, each minute dragging as the darkness enveloped us. Every snap of a twig or distant rustle of leaves felt like a warning, a signal that something was watching us from the shadows. As the firelight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the surrounding trees, Ken and Yumi recounted their unsettling encounter with the ghostly figures. Their descriptions were vague but unnerving, shadows that moved unnaturally and seemed to shimmer in and out of existence. "We tried to follow them," Ken said, his voice trembling, "but they vanished as soon as we got close." Haru, who had been silent for a while, finally spoke up. "The forest is known for being a place where lost souls linger. It's said that those who come here with unresolved issues become part of the forest's energy." I nodded, trying to process the information. If that's true, then the figures we saw could be the souls of people who came here seeking an end but never found peace. Aiko shivered, her breath visible in the cold air. "I don't like the idea of being surrounded by restless spirits. It feels like we're intruding on their space." We decided to take turns keeping watch through the night, each of us feeling the weight of the forest's dark reputation pressing down on us. I took the first shift, sitting quietly by the fire and scanning the darkness with my flashlight. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their branches swaying gently in the wind. As the hours passed, the forest seemed to come alive with whispers. They were faint at first, just barely audible over the crackling of the fire. But as the night wore on, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They were disjointed, barely recognizable as words, but the sense of despair and sorrow in their tones was undeniable. I glanced over at Haru, who was asleep in his tent, the only visible sign of movement being the rise and fall of his breathing. His face was lined with worry even in sleep, and I wondered what thoughts plagued his mind. He had been deeply affected by the forest's reputation, and it was clear that the experience was taking a toll on him. Around midnight, the whispers took on a more coherent form. I could make out snippets of phrases: "Help me," "lost," and "can't find peace." The words seemed to come from all directions, creating a disorienting effect. I tried to calm my racing heart, telling myself it was just the forest playing tricks on us. Suddenly the fire flickered violently, and the temperature dropped sharply. I felt a chill run down my spine as an unnatural coldness enveloped the clearing. The forest grew even quieter, the usual nocturnal sounds of crickets and rustling leaves now conspicuously absent. Then came the screams. They were distant at first, barely audible over the wind, but they grew louder and more frantic. The sound was both human and inhuman, a primal, guttural cry that seemed to pierce the silence of the night. The screams echoed through the trees, sending shivers down my spine. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the darkness, searching for the source of the sound. The beam of light cut through the night, but there was nothing to see, just the oppressive forest closing in around us. The screams persisted, growing louder and more desperate, as if they were coming from all around us. I called out to my friends, shaking them awake. "Get up! We need to check this out!" Ken, Yumi, and Aiko scrambled out of their tents, their faces pale with fear. The fire had burned down to a few embers, and the cold was biting through our clothes. "What's going on?" Ken asked, his voice shaky. "I don't know," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "But we need to find out where those screams are coming from." We gathered our equipment and set out into the forest, following the direction of the sounds. The forest was now a labyrinth of shadows and twisting trees, each step we took echoing eerily in the silence. The screams continued, interspersed with soft, mournful whispers. As we ventured deeper, we came across more abandoned tents and scattered personal items. The sight was unsettling, each tent a silent testament to the lives that had been touched by the forest's darkness. Aiko found a crumpled note near one of the tents, its contents barely legible but filled with phrases like, "Can't escape," and "Forgive me." The deeper we went, the more intense the feeling of being watched became. The trees seemed to press in on us, their branches forming an almost impenetrable canopy. Every now and then, we glimpsed fleeting shadows moving among the trunks, but they disappeared as quickly as they appeared. We stumbled upon a small clearing with an old, decrepit shrine. The shrine was covered in moss and dirt, its once vibrant colors faded and chipped. Offerings of flowers and incense lay scattered around it, now wilted and decayed. "This must be a place where people came to seek some sort of solace," Haru said, his voice reverent. "But it looks like even this hasn't offered them any peace." As we approached the shrine, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to be coming from the shrine itself, as if the spirits were trying to communicate with us through its crumbling walls. The temperature dropped further, and the air felt heavy with an oppressive energy. The cries and whispers combined into a haunting chorus, the voices melding into a single mournful wail. The forest seemed to close in around us, the shadows growing darker and more oppressive. "Let's get out of here," Yumi said, her voice trembling. "This place is too much." We turned to leave, but the screams grew louder and more desperate. The shadows seemed to stretch and warp, and a feeling of dread settled over us. It was as if the forest itself was fighting against us, trying to prevent us from leaving. As we retraced our steps, the screams faded into distant echoes. The forest was silent once more, but the feeling of being watched remained. The oppressive darkness seemed to follow us, and the sense of foreboding grew stronger with each step. When we finally returned to our camp, the fire had died down completely. We huddled together, the cold night air pressing in on us. The haunting cries of the forest had left their mark, and the darkness of Aokigahara had seeped into our very souls. The forest had shown us its true nature, a place of despair and restless spirits, where the echoes of the past lingered and the boundaries between the living and the dead blurred. We were no longer just visitors. We had become part of the forest's story, and the darkness that had touched us would stay with us long after we left. Part 3. The oppressive atmosphere of Aokigahara Forest seemed to suffocate us as we huddled together by the dying embers of the campfire. The haunting cries from earlier had left an indelible mark on our psyche. Every rustle of the wind and snap of a twig felt like a reminder of the malevolent presence that surrounded us. Ken, who had been skeptical about the paranormal, now appeared deeply unsettled. His face was pale and his hands trembled slightly as he tried to stoke the fire. "We need to stay calm," he said, though his voice betrayed his fear. "Let's stick together and keep an eye out." Aiko, clutching her camera tightly, nodded in agreement. "We should review the footage we've captured so far. Maybe we missed something that could explain what we've experienced." We set up our equipment around the fire and began reviewing the footage. The camera's night vision showed the dark, twisted landscape of the forest, interspersed with occasional glimpses of movement. The shadows on the screen seemed to dance and shift, adding to the feeling of unease. As we watched, I noticed something disturbing. In several frames, fleeting shapes appeared in the background, moving too quickly to be identified. It was as if the forest itself was alive with hidden entities, their forms barely visible but undeniably present. "That's not just shadows," I said, pointing to the screen. "Look at those shapes. They're moving in ways that don't make sense." Haru, who had been unusually quiet, stared intently at the footage. "It could be residual energy," he said. "The forest is known for having strong spiritual energy. What we're seeing might be the result of that." Aiko shivered. "Or it could be something else entirely. Something that's not just residual but actively trying to communicate." The temperature around the campfire seemed to drop even further. We all felt the chill, and the sense of dread intensified. The whispers from earlier had returned, now louder and more coherent. The words were clearer, though still disjointed. Pleas for help and cries of despair. "I don't think we're alone," Yumi said, her voice quivering. "It feels like the forest is closing in on us." As if in response, a sudden gust of wind swept through the clearing, extinguishing the campfire's remaining embers. We were plunged into darkness, our flashlights flickering as the cold air pressed in around us. "Everyone stay close," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We need to relight the fire and stay together." We fumbled in the dark, trying to relight the campfire. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the haunting whispers that seemed to come from all directions. The forest felt alive with unseen eyes, watching us from the shadows. When the fire was finally rekindled, we huddled around it, trying to find comfort in its warmth. The eerie whispers continued, growing louder and more insistent. It was as if the forest itself was trying to convey a message, though its meaning remained elusive. Suddenly, we heard a loud crash from deeper within the forest. The sound was followed by a series of high-pitched screams, cutting through the night with terrifying clarity. The screams were different from what we had heard before, more frantic, more desperate. "We need to check that out," Ken said, his voice filled with urgency. "Someone might be in trouble." Reluctantly, we gathered our equipment and set out toward the source of the noise. The forest was dark and foreboding, the trees seeming to close in around us as we moved. The screams continued, growing louder with each step. As we ventured deeper into the forest, we came across an old, dilapidated cabin. It was hidden among the trees, its wooden walls weathered and covered in moss. The cabin looked like it had been abandoned for years, its windows broken and its door hanging off its hinges. The screams were now clearly coming from inside the cabin. We approached cautiously, our flashlights casting eerie shadows on the cabin's exterior. The air was thick with an unnatural coldness, and the whispers had grown louder, blending with the cries of despair. "Let's go inside," Aiko said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to see what's causing those screams." We entered the cabin, our footsteps echoing in the empty space. The interior was dark and cluttered, with old furniture covered in dust and cobwebs. The walls were adorned with strange symbols and markings, their meaning inscrutable. In the center of the room, we found a large, rusty metal box. The box was covered in grime and looked out of place in the otherwise decrepit cabin. The screams had stopped, replaced by a haunting silence. "What is this?" Yumi asked, her voice trembling as she examined the box. Haru carefully approached the box and examined it. "It looks like it could be some sort of containment unit. I've heard of similar things being used to trap or contain spiritual entities." We hesitated for a moment before opening the box. Inside, we found a collection of old, worn objects, personal belongings, photographs, and handwritten notes. Each item seemed to be connected to the forest's dark history. One of the photographs was of a young woman, her face hauntingly familiar. The note attached to it read, "Help me. I'm lost and alone." The atmosphere in the cabin grew even colder, and the feeling of being watched intensified. The whispers outside grew louder, merging into a chorus of voices pleading for release. "Let's get out of here," Ken said, his voice filled with fear. "This place is giving me the creeps." We quickly left the cabin, the whispers and cries still echoing in our ears. As we made our way back to our camp, the forest seemed to press in on us, the darkness growing thicker and more oppressive. Back at the camp, the fire was once again reduced to a few embers. The night was still and silent, the earlier noises now a distant memory. We were exhausted and shaken, our minds racing with the implications of what we had discovered. The cabin and its contents had added a new layer of horror to our experience. The items we found suggested a deeper, more disturbing connection between the forest and the restless souls that inhabited it. The whispers and screams were not just random noises, they were a part of something much larger and more malevolent. As we settled back into our tents, the darkness outside seemed even more impenetrable. The feeling of unease persisted, and the forest's secrets remained just out of reach. The night was far from over, and we knew that there were still more horrors to uncover in the depths of Aokigahara Forest. Part 4. The stillness of the night seemed to deepen as we lay in our tents, the forest's oppressive energy seeping into our very bones. Each of us was lost in our own thoughts, haunted by the eerie discoveries from the cabin. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by the distant echoes of the forest's mournful cries. I was jolted awake by a sudden, bone-chilling scream. It was different from the ones we had heard earlier, more urgent, more human. I scrambled out of my tent, my flashlight cutting through the darkness as I searched for the source of the sound. "Everyone, wake up!" I shouted. "We need to find out what's happening." Ken, Aiko, Yumi, and Haru emerged from their tents, their faces pale with fear. The air was filled with an intense, unnatural cold, and the forest seemed to close in around us, the trees now more like dark, looming figures. "What's going on?" Yumi asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I said, "but that scream was too real to ignore." We grabbed our equipment and made our way toward the direction of the scream. The forest was even more unsettling in the dark. The shadows seemed to twist and move with a life of their own. The usual nighttime sounds were absent, replaced by an eerie silence that was periodically broken by distant cries and whispers. As we walked, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Every now and then, we would catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of our eyes. But when we turned to look, there was nothing there. The air was thick with an oppressive energy, making it hard to breathe. After what felt like hours of navigating through the dark forest, we came across another clearing. In the center of the clearing was an old, rusted metal structure, a water tower, long abandoned and overgrown with vines. It loomed over us like a dark sentinel. "That scream came from around here," Ken said, his voice strained. "We need to search this area." We spread out, our flashlights cutting narrow paths through the darkness. As we moved, we discovered more abandoned items: torn clothes, empty bottles, and discarded personal belongings. Each item was a grim reminder of those who had come before us, seeking solace or an end. Haru, who had been examining a pile of discarded items, suddenly let out a gasp. "Guys, come here! You need to see this." We gathered around him, and he pointed to a series of strange markings etched into the ground. The markings formed a crude circular pattern, with symbols and runes that seemed almost ancient. The symbols were unfamiliar, but they radiated an unsettling energy. "These symbols," Aiko said, her voice barely a whisper. "They look like they might be related to some sort of ritual." The air grew colder still, and the whispers in the forest seemed to grow louder. The voices were now distinctly angry, their tone filled with frustration and rage. It was as if the forest itself was reacting to our presence. Suddenly, we heard the scream again, closer this time. It was a frantic, high-pitched wail that seemed to pierce the night. Without thinking, we followed the sound, moving quickly through the forest. We came upon a second cabin, even older and more decrepit than the first. The door was ajar, and the interior was shrouded in darkness. The screams were now a cacophony of voices, echoing from inside the cabin. "Should we go in?" Yumi asked, her voice trembling. "We have to," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "We need to find out what's causing this." We entered the cabin, our flashlights revealing a scene that was both horrifying and surreal. The interior was filled with old, rotting furniture and strange, arcane objects. The walls were covered in similar symbols to those we had seen earlier, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. In the center of the room was a large, ancient book, its pages filled with more of the strange symbols and diagrams. The book was open to a page depicting a ritual, a dark and twisted ceremony that seemed to involve summoning or binding spirits. "This book," Haru said, his voice shaky. "It looks like it's describing some kind of ritual for controlling or trapping spirits." As we examined the book, the screams grew louder, becoming a deafening roar. The forest outside seemed to come alive with a renewed fury, the wind howling through the trees and causing the cabin to shake. "Something's happening outside," Ken said, his eyes wide with fear. "We need to get out of here." We hurriedly gathered our equipment and exited the cabin, the screams and whispers now a chaotic symphony of despair. The forest was in turmoil, the trees swaying violently and the shadows shifting unpredictably. As we made our way back to our camp, the forest seemed to close in around us, the oppressive darkness more suffocating than ever. The feeling of being watched had reached its peak, and the whispers now seemed to be directly addressing us, their voices filled with anger and sorrow. We finally reached our camp, but the fire was now completely out, leaving us in near total darkness. The forest was eerily silent once more, the screams and whispers having ceased abruptly. "What just happened?" Aiko asked, her voice filled with bewilderment. "I don't know," I said, my own fear evident. "But whatever we've stirred up in this forest, it's not going to let us leave easily." The night felt like it would never end, the oppressive darkness pressing in on us. We huddled together, trying to find some comfort in each other's presence. The forest had revealed more of its sinister nature, and we knew that the night was far from over. The horrors that awaited us were still hidden in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered. Part 5. As dawn approached, the darkness of the forest seemed to intensify, despite the first hints of daylight filtering through the dense canopy. The oppressive atmosphere had not lifted, and the sense of dread that had settled over us felt almost tangible. We were exhausted and on edge, our nerves frayed from the relentless terror of the night. "I think we should pack up and leave," Ken said, his voice weary. "This place is getting worse, and I don't think we're safe here anymore." I agreed, and we began the arduous task of packing up our equipment and belongings. The forest around us seemed to watch our every move, the trees standing like silent witnesses to our departure. The eerie silence that had replaced the earlier cries and whispers was unsettling, as if the forest was holding its breath in anticipation. As we worked, Haru found something buried under a pile of leaves near the edge of the camp. It was a small, weathered box, its surface covered in dirt and grime. Haru carefully opened it, revealing a collection of photographs and letters. "These must belong to someone who was here before us," Aiko said, peering over Haru's shoulder. "They might give us some insight into what's been happening." We examined the contents of the box. The photographs depicted various people, some looking hopeful, others appearing distressed. The letters were filled with desperate pleas for help and cryptic messages about the forest's malevolent energy. One letter caught my attention. It was written in a shaky hand and contained a chilling message. "The forest has claimed us. We are its prisoners. It feeds on our fear. Escape while you still can." The ominous warning sent a shiver down my spine. It was clear that the forest was not just a place of paranormal activity. It was a living entity, feeding on the despair of those who ventured into its depths. "We need to get out of here now," I said, my voice urgent. "If we stay any longer, we might become part of the forest's dark history." We finished packing and prepared to leave, but as we made our way back through the forest, the oppressive energy seemed to return with renewed force. The shadows seemed to close in around us, and the air grew heavy with an almost tangible fear. Suddenly we heard a loud mechanical noise, like the sound of an old engine struggling to start. It was coming from deeper within the forest. We exchanged worried glances, unsure of whether to investigate or continue our escape. "I think we should check it out," Haru said, his curiosity getting the better of him. "It could be important." Reluctantly we followed the sound, pushing through the dense underbrush. The noise grew louder, and we soon stumbled upon an old, decrepit military vehicle, an armored jeep, long abandoned and covered in rust. The jeep was outfitted with strange equipment, including what appeared to be surveillance cameras and other devices. The setup was old-fashioned but functional, with wires and monitors strewn about. This looks like some sort of monitoring equipment, Ken said, examining the setup. Maybe it's connected to the strange happenings we've encountered. A closer inspection revealed that the cameras were indeed functional, with their lenses covered in grime but still intact. The Jeep also had a tracking device and a microphone system. The presence of such equipment in this remote location was perplexing and disturbing. Haru found a logbook inside the vehicle. Flipping through its pages, we discovered detailed notes and diagrams related to the forest's supernatural phenomena. The entries were written by someone who seemed to have a deep understanding of the forest's dark powers and was clearly studying or controlling it. Whoever was here was definitely tracking people, Aiko said, her voice shaking. They were using these devices to monitor and manipulate them. As we continued to examine the equipment, the forest grew even more oppressive. The shadows seemed to move with purpose, and the air was thick with a sense of impending doom. The feeling of being watched intensified, and the whispers returned, now louder and more insistent. "We need to leave," I said, my voice urgent. "This place is getting dangerous." We made our way back to our original path, but the forest seemed to resist our departure. The trees closed in around us, and the ground seemed to shift underfoot. It was as if the forest itself was trying to keep us from leaving. Just as we reached the edge of the forest, we heard a deafening crash behind us. We turned to see the old military jeep, now engulfed in flames. The fire roared through the vehicle, consuming it in a matter of seconds. "That's not possible," Ken said, his eyes wide with shock. "We didn't even see anyone else here." The fire lit up the surrounding area, casting eerie shadows on the trees. The flames seemed to dance and writhe, almost as if they were alive. The whispers grew louder, merging into a cacophony of voices that filled the night. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice trembling with fear. "Now!" We ran toward the forest's edge, the fire's light casting long, distorted shadows on the ground. The forest seemed to close in behind us, the darkness pressing in with an almost physical force. The whispers and cries of the forest reached a fever pitch, filling the night with an overwhelming sense of terror. When we finally reached our vehicle, we piled in and drove away from the forest as quickly as we could. The forest's dark secrets remained behind us, but the feeling of dread and the echoes of its cries would linger long after we had left its confines. As we drove through the Nevada desert, the first rays of dawn began to break through the darkness. The forest receded into the distance, but its presence was still palpable, a lingering shadow on our minds, a reminder of the horrors we had encountered. We had survived Aokigahara Forest, but the experience had changed us forever. The forest had shown us its true nature, a place of darkness and despair, where the boundaries between the living and the dead were blurred. The echoes of the forest's cries and the whispers of its restless spirits would remain with us, a haunting reminder of the night we had faced the forest of horror. Part 6. The desert landscape outside Aokigahara was a stark contrast to the oppressive forest we had just left. The sun's first light filtered through the dusty windshield of our vehicle, casting a warm, almost reassuring glow. But the sense of relief was fleeting. The terror we had experienced in the forest still clung to us, as if we were not fully free from its grasp. We drove in silence, each of us lost in our thoughts, processing the nightmarish events that had unfolded. The logbook, the eerie equipment, and the sight of the burning jeep were etched into our memories, blending with the forest's haunting cries. "Do you think we'll ever really understand what happened back there?" Aiko finally asked, breaking the silence. Her voice was strained, tinged with a mixture of fear and curiosity. "I don't know," I said, shaking my head. "The forest, it's like it has a mind of its own. There's something deeply wrong with it." Haru, who had been staring out of the window, suddenly spoke up. "We need to report what we found. If there's anyone else who might be in danger, they need to know what's out there." "Agreed," Ken said. "But we should also consider the possibility that there's more to discover. This may not be the end of the story." The thought sent a shiver down my spine. The forest had felt like an endless labyrinth of horror, and the idea that there could be more to uncover was both intriguing and terrifying. We finally reached the nearest town, a small, dusty settlement that seemed a world away from the horrors of the forest. We stopped at a local diner to collect our thoughts and to figure out our next steps. The place was quiet, with only a few locals scattered around, their conversations low and subdued. As we sat in a booth, discussing our plans, a middle-aged man with a grizzled beard approached our table. He introduced himself as a local historian with an interest in the area's folklore. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation," he said, his voice carrying a hint of curiosity. "You've been to Aokigahara Forest, haven't you?" I glanced at my friends, surprised by his knowledge. "Yes, we were just there." "How did you know?" The historian's eyes darkened. "I've heard stories about that place, stories of people going in and never coming back. Some say the forest is alive, feeding on the despair of those who enter. It's not just a place of natural beauty. It's a place of dark energies and malevolent forces." His words echoed the fears we had felt in the forest. "We experienced something like that," I said, my voice trembling. "The whispers, the shadows, they felt like they were trying to keep us there." The historian nodded. "You're not the first to encounter such phenomena. Many have gone into that forest, driven by curiosity or despair, only to vanish without a trace. The forest has its own agenda, and it's not always clear what it wants." We shared our findings with him: the logbook, the photographs, and the strange symbols. As he examined the items, his expression grew more concerned. "This is disturbing," he said, handing back the items. "The symbols, the rituals, they suggest a deep connection between the forest and the supernatural. It's as if the forest has its own way of communicating with those who enter." Aiko's face paled. "Do you think there's a way to stop it? To protect others from experiencing what we did?" The historian shook his head. "There are old rituals and protective measures mentioned in folklore, but they're not foolproof. The best advice I can give is to stay away from that forest. It has a way of drawing people in and consuming them." As we left the diner, we felt a mix of relief and unease. The historian's words confirmed our fears and added a new layer of understanding to our experience. Aokigahara Forest was not just a place of natural beauty or tragic history. It was a living entity with its own dark will and purpose. We spent the next few days trying to return to normal life, but the memories of the forest and its sinister secrets lingered. The screams, the whispers, and the shadows had left an indelible mark on us, and we knew that we would never be the same. Each of us grappled with the experience in our own way, seeking solace in different activities. Ken buried himself in research, trying to understand the forest's dark history. Aiko poured her energy into documenting our experience, hoping that sharing our story might help others. Haru tried to make sense of the rituals and symbols, searching for any clues that could explain what we had encountered. Yumi focused on rebuilding her sense of security, finding comfort in the mundane routines of daily life. As the months passed, the terror of Aokigahara Forest faded into the background of our lives, but it never truly left us. The forest had shown us its true nature, a place of darkness and despair, where the boundaries between the living and the dead were blurred. The echoes of its cries and the whispers of its restless spirits remained with us, a haunting reminder of the night we faced the forest of horror. We had survived the forest, but the experience had changed us forever. The forest had claimed a part of us, leaving behind a lingering shadow that would follow us for the rest of our lives. And though we had escaped its grasp, we knew that its dark presence would always be a part of our stories, a chilling reminder of the night we ventured into the heart of Aokigahara Forest. So, my friends, that's the end of the story. You can go to my playlist and see many more interesting, scary stories.